We're ready to go. Is the door closed?
Doors closed.
Yeah.
Okay.
At the age of 73, George Strait finally did something he had avoided for decades. He spoke the truth. Not about his records, not about his awards, not even about his legendary career as the undisputed king of country music. This time, George Strait spoke about Toby Keith, and when he did, it stunned fans across the country. For years, rumors had followed them. Whispers of rivalry, speculation about tension, endless debates over who truly represented the soul of modern country music. George Strait always stayed silent. While others chased headlines, he let his music speak. While controversy swirled, he stepped back. While fans demanded answers, he simply smiled and walked away. But now, at 73, something changed. In a rare, candid moment, George Strait decided it was time to set the record straight. Not with anger, not with accusations, but with honesty. And what he revealed wasn't what anyone expected, because behind the rumors, behind the exaggerated rivalries, behind decades of speculation, there was a story far more human, far more complex, and far more revealing about the true nature of fame, respect, and legacy in country music. To understand why George Strait finally chose to speak, we must go back to the very beginning, back to a small town in Texas, back to wide open land, hard work, and simple values, back to the man before the legend was ever born, long before the sold-out stadiums, the chart-topping hits, and the crown of King of Country. George Strait was just a boy growing up in Poteet, Texas. He was born on May 18, 1952, into a world far removed from fame, wide open land, dusty roads, working class values passed down through generations. When his parents divorced, George and his brother were raised by their father on a cattle ranch. Life wasn't glamorous. It was demanding, honest, and grounded in responsibility. Mornings began early, work came before comfort, and respect wasn't optional, it was expected. Those years shaped him. The loneliness of rural life, the quiet strength of independence, the unspoken lessons of resilience. They would later echo through every lyric he sang. Music entered his life not as a dream of a stardom, but as a companion. Encouraged by family, George picked up a guitar and began singing in school and at local gatherings. There was no showmanship yet, no grand ambition, just a natural voice, smooth, calm, and unmistakably sincere. After high school, his path took an unexpected turn. George enlisted in the United States Army in the early 1970s and was stationed in Hawaii. Even there, far from Texas soil, music followed him. He joined an Army-sponsored band and performed whenever he could, slowly realizing that music wasn't just something he enjoyed, it was who he was. When his service ended, he returned home and enrolled at college, majoring in agriculture. On paper, it was a practical choice. In reality, his heart was elsewhere. Nights were spent performing in small honky-tonks. Days were filled with uncertainty. Recognition came slowly, if at all, but something set him apart. While the industry around him was beginning to flirt with pop influences and flashy trends, George stayed rooted in tradition, storytelling, melody, authentic emotion, no gimmicks, no shortcuts. Unknowingly, he was building the foundation for one of the most enduring careers in music history. And soon, the world was about to hear his voice. For years, George Strait played wherever he could. Small Texas bars, smoke-filled honky-tonks, stages where the crowd barely listened and the pay barely covered gas money. There was no overnight success, no industry buzz, no promises. But those long nights did something important. They sharpened his voice. They refined his presence. They taught him restraint. George didn't try to dominate the stage. He didn't shout. He didn't force emotion. He stood still, let the melody breathe, and trusted this story to do the work. Then in 1981, everything changed. A song called Unwound was released. It didn't scream for attention. It didn't chase trends. It sounded like classic country, honest, melodic, and timeless. And audiences noticed. Unwound climbed the country charts quietly but steadily, announcing the arrival of a new kind of a star. Soon after, his debut album, A Straight Country, followed, reinforcing what fans already felt. This wasn't a fad. This wasn't a crossover experiment. This was the real thing. At a time when country music was drifting toward pop influences, George Strait did the opposite. He leaned into fiddles, steel guitars, and stories about love, heartbreak, family, and ordinary life. And instead of being left behind, he surged ahead. Hit after hit followed. Year after year, his songs reached number one. Album after album, his style never wavered. While others reinvented themselves, George refined himself. He didn't chase the spotlight. The spotlight followed him. Soon, the industry had no choice but to acknowledge what fans already knew. George Strait wasn't just successful, he was redefining what longevity looked like in country music. And as his legend grew, so did the comparisons. Other artists rose, new personalities emerged, different styles clashed. Among them, one name would eventually spark years of speculation, debate, and whispered rivalry. But George said nothing. He stayed focused, he stayed silent, he stayed true. Because while fame was growing louder, George Strait was preparing for something much deeper, a legacy built not on noise but on respect. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, George Strait was no longer just a successful artist. He was untouchable. While trends in country music rose and fell, his career moved in one steady direction, upward. Year after year, his singles reached number one. Not because they were flashy, not because they were controversial, but because they felt real. Love that didn't last, heartbreak that lingered, family, faith, and the comfort of familiar places. Audiences heard themselves in his songs. What made his success even more remarkable was what he refused to do. He didn't chase pop radio. He didn't reinvent his image. He didn't manufacture drama. He trusted tradition. That trust paid off in historic ways. Over the decades, George Strait accumulated more number one hits on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart than any artist in any genre, not just country, any genre. Quietly, without spectacle, he broke records others never imagined touching. His albums became staples. His voice became instantly recognizable. His name became synonymous with authenticity. Younger artists studied him. Veterans respected him. Fans relied on him. Yet as his dominance continued, the industry began doing what it always does, comparing who was more influential, who represented real country, who had the bigger impact. As newer, louder personalities emerged, the media started framing narratives. Rivalries were hinted at, differences were exaggerated, stories were shaped not by facts, but by contrast. George remained unmoved. He didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He didn't correct the rumors. Instead, he let the music and the numbers speak. Tours sold out effortlessly. His live shows became legendary not for theatrics, but for connection. He stood on stage with minimal movement, minimal words, and maximum presence. Fans came for the songs. They stayed for the feeling. And even as fame reached its peak, George Strait kept his private life exactly that, private. Because while the world was focused on charts and comparisons, George was anchored somewhere else entirely, with family, with loyalty, with values forged long before fame ever arrived. While the world saw George Strait as a legend, at home, he was simply a husband and a father. In 1971, long before fame complicated everything, George married his high school sweetheart, Norma. Their love began quietly, without headlines or spectacle, and it stayed that way. In an industry where relationships often collapsed under pressure, theirs endured. They built a life rooted in privacy. They avoided the spotlight. They protected what mattered most. Together, they raised 2 children, Jennifer and George Bubba Strait Jr., instilling the same Texas values that had shaped George himself: faith, humility, and hard work. Despite his success, George was determined that his children experience as normal a childhood as possible. But life had other plans. In 1986, tragedy struck without warning. Jennifer, only 13 years old, was killed in a car accident. The loss was devastating. There are no words for losing a child, no music, no awards, no success that can soften that kind of pain. George and Norma retreated even further from public view, choosing a grief in private rather than sympathy in public. For a time, many wondered how George continued at all, but instead of allowing sorrow to consume them, the family transformed pain into purpose. In Jennifer's memory, they created a foundation dedicated to helping children in need. It was never about publicity. It was about honoring a life gone far too soon. That loss changed George forever. It deepened the emotion in his voice. It sharpened his perspective. It stripped away anything that didn't truly matter. From that point on, fame became secondary, legacy became personal, and silence became a choice, not an absence. As the years passed, George continued to perform, to record, to tour, but always on his own terms. And when he finally announced his farewell tour, it wasn't framed as an ending, it was framed as gratitude. Because after everything he had endured, George Strait understood something few ever do. Time is the most valuable thing of all. And with time came reflection. Reflection not just on his life, but on the people he had shared the industry with, including one man the public never stopped asking him about. By the early 2010s, George Strait had already achieved what most artists only dream of, but he didn't act like a man chasing more. In January 2013, he embarked on what became one of the most talked about moments in country music history, the Cowboy Rides Away tour. It wasn't just a tour, it felt like the closing chapter of an era. 2 massive legs, crowds that filled arenas night after night, and a lineup of prominent country artists joining him as opening acts, almost like the entire genre showing up to pay respect. One performance even set a record for the largest gross at a single-show country concert, proving something undeniable. George Strait didn't need controversy to sell tickets. He didn't need noise to stay relevant. He simply had to walk on stage. Even after that farewell tour, his music continued. He released later albums like Cold Beer Conversation in 2015 and Honky Tonk Time Machine in 2019, reminding fans that his voice still carried the same timeless strength. Critics and audiences received them warmly, not because they were trying to keep up, but because they sounded like George Strait, classic, steady, unmistakably his. And over time, age changed his perspective, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way. The older he got, the less he cared about rumors, the less he cared about comparisons. and the more he cared about telling the truth, when the truth actually mattered. For decades, people had asked him the same question. What's the real story between you and Toby Keith? And for decades, George Strait avoided it. He wasn't the type to turn fellow artists into entertainment. He wasn't interested in public spats. He didn't feed the gossip machine. But then, at 73, something shifted. In a recent interview, George Strait finally addressed Toby Keith directly. His words were calm, measured, and almost painfully honest. He explained that he had been asked for years and never felt the need to comment before. But now, at this stage in his life and career, he wanted to set the record straight. Not to attack Toby, not to embarrass him, but to end the speculation. And what made this moment so powerful was how rare it was. George Strait is known for being private and professional, rarely stepping into any kind of controversy. So when he chose to speak, people listened like it was a confession. And then came the line that changed everything. He said Toby was talented, no doubt. He acknowledged Toby's tremendous career and his work ethic. But he also made something clear. They were different people, different approaches, different ways of existing in the same industry. And the difference over the years had led to misunderstandings, at least in the eyes of the public. But the real truth was not what the rumors claim. When George Strait finally spoke about Toby Keith, many expected confrontation. They didn't get it. What they heard instead was something far more mature and far more revealing about who George Strait truly is. He said plainly that Toby Keith is a talented artist, that his career speaks for itself, that no one achieves that level of success without working hard. There was no sarcasm, no backhanded praise, just acknowledgement. But then George addressed the core of the misunderstanding. They were never enemies. They were simply different. Toby Keith built his image on boldness, on outspoken opinions, on a larger-than-life personality that didn't shy away from controversy. His music reflected that energy, brash, patriotic, unapologetic. George Strait, on the other hand, chose restraint. He avoided headlines, he avoided arguments, he avoided turning personal views into public statements. That contrast, George explained, is where the so-called rivalry was born. When two powerful figures take different paths in the same industry, people assume conflict. The media exaggerates it. Fans pick sides. Stories grow legs without ever touching the truth. George admitted that they crossed paths many times over the years. They didn't always see eye to eye, but he made one thing unmistakably clear. He never held grudges. He never wanted it to be personal. And he never believed music was about competition. Music is bigger than any one of us, he said. He also spoke about how fame distorts reality. Long careers create pressure. Pressure creates narratives, and narratives are often mistaken for truth. Younger artists come in full of fire, George explained, full of ambition, and sometimes the passion gets misread as conflict. Toby was one of those artists, driven, outspoken, unwilling to stay quiet. But that didn't make him an enemy. It made him different. And in George Strait's eyes, difference never required division. What struck fans the most wasn't what George said about Toby. It was what he refused to say. He didn't criticize. He didn't revisit old stories. He didn't air private disagreements. Because at 73, he understood something deeply. Life is too short to keep fighting battles that were never real in the first place. And as he spoke, it became clear that this wasn't just about Toby Keith. It was about perspective, about maturity, about letting go. George Strait didn't talk like a man trying to win an argument. He talked like a man looking back on a lifetime. He said that when you reach 73, your priorities change. The things that once felt huge start to feel small. The comparisons, the headlines, the rumors, none of it carries the same weight anymore. What matters is what's real: family, music, the legacy you will leave behind. And that's why his words about Toby Keith landed so hard, because they weren't fueled by emotion in the moment. They were shaped by decades of experience. George admitted that people expected him to weigh in over the years, to comment on Toby's actions, to take a side, to confirm or deny the stories. But he said most of what people think they know was never the whole story. That line alone exposed how much the public had been filling in blanks with assumptions. George explained how the industry can twist things. When artists stay relevant for as long as he and Toby have, the public starts looking for drama to explain the coexistence of two successful careers. And the media often sells that drama as truth. But George was blunt about what he believed. There's room for everyone in country music, he said. He admired what Toby brought to the table: the voice, the presence, and that undeniable connection with the audience. And then he delivered the kind of statement only someone secure in their legacy can make. He believed talent and dedication should speak louder than headlines. That was the real truth fans weren't expecting. Not that he hated Toby, not that they were rivals behind closed doors, but that George Strait simply refused to let gossip define a fellow artist or himself. He said he had learned to let go of grudges, let go of petty comparisons, and to see people for what they really are, not for what rumors claimed them to be. And in the end, he summed it up with a simplicity that felt almost shocking in today's world. Toby is a professional, and I respect that. It's really that simple. That wasn't just a comment about Toby Keith. It was a statement about who George Strait has always been. Quiet strength, measured words, a life built on respect. When George Strait finished speaking about Toby Keith, there was no dramatic ending, no punchline, no final shot, no attempt to rewrite history. Instead, he left fans with something far more uncomfortable and far more meaningful: context. He said he hoped people would stop jumping to conclusions about public figures, that they would remember every artist has a different path, a different personality, and a different way of expressing themselves. What looks like conflict from the outside is often nothing more than contrast. George made it clear that both he and Toby spent their lives doing the same thing in their own way: entertaining people, making music that mattered, and honoring the fans who supported them for decades. That, he said, is what truly unites artists. Not chart positions, not headlines, not imagined rivalries, just the music. For many fans, this moment reshaped how they viewed both men. Toby Keith was no longer the opposite of George Strait, and George Strait was no longer the silent half of an unspoken feud. They were simply two professionals who chose different roads and stayed on them. At 73, George Strait didn't reveal a scandal, he revealed perspective. And that may be the most powerful thing he's ever shared, because behind the records, behind the legend, behind the crown of King of Country, he reminded everyone of something timeless. Respect lasts longer than rumors. Legacy matters more than noise. And sometimes the truth is quiet.